violence related to drug trafficking in Mexico has resulted in more than 300,000 deaths since 2006, when the government intensified its fight against drug cartels. The situation has generated a series of challenges in terms of security and stability in the country. For years, drug cartels have battled for control of strategic territories, unleashing a wave of violence, murder, and armed conflicts. This violence has not only affected those involved in drug trafficking, but also entire communities live under constant insecurity. Despite government efforts to combat the issue, the fight against drug trafficking remains a significant challenge in Mexico, with profound implications for the country's security and stability. In a recent debate among Republican presidential hopefuls, Ron DeSantis expressed a rather aggressive vision for tackling crime and drug trafficking.
So, as president, would you support sending U.S. Special Forces over the border into Mexico to take out fentanyl labs, to take out drug cartel operations? Would you support that kind of American military use?
Yes, and I will do it on day one. Here's the thing. The cartels are killing tens of thousands of our fellow citizens. You want to talk about a country in decline? You have the cartels controlling a lot of part of your southern border. We have to reestablish the rule of law, and we have to defend our people. The President of the United States has got to use all available powers as Commander-in-Chief to protect our country and to protect the people. So when they're coming across, yes, we're going to use lethal force.
To better understand the issue, we talked to Pierre Gaussens, who is a PhD in sociology and master in labor law. He has researched on indigenous peoples, social movements, and human rights, also on state and local governments. His books include titles about self-defense groups, colonialism, social movements, and a critique of the Latin American left. His latest book is The Poppy in Crisis: Rise and Decline of Mexican Opium. Dr. Pierre Gaussens, thanks for being with us. Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, recently declared on a presidential debate that he would use U.S. special forces inside Mexico to fight cartels and criminal bands. What's your comment about this?
Pues es que esta declaración no es la primera, ¿no? Se inscribe en una larga lista de
Well, this statement is not the first. It is part of a long list of statements of this type, similar, even a bit repetitive, by conservative leaders in the United States, particularly leaders of the Republican Party who have made this type of statement. And we can also go back in the history of U.S. interventionism in the fight against drugs and drug trafficking, basically from the 1970s onward, with the anti-drug policy initiated by the Nixon administration. So since then, we have had an increasingly significant interference by the United States under the pretext of drugs and the fight against drugs. So this statement is not new in this sense. It has a long history and is symptomatic of this interventionism, this interference of U.S. policy in Mexico under the pretext, I say the reason, in the best cases, of the fight against drugs. But it is still problematic in several aspects. In the first place, because the fight against drugs is instrumentalized as a very comfortable pretext for U.S. neoconservative leaders to justify interventionism in Mexico and its governments and institutions of the Mexican state, which are presented as failed or corrupt or ineffective, and therefore so much so that they require this U.S. support to solve these problems that are always located south of the border and not north. When in reality, we look around and see things from Mexico, we see that the underlying problem in relation to drugs and drug trafficking has to do with consumption. Drug production in Mexico does nothing more than respond to a demand that is north of the border, in the United States consumer market, and therefore, as long as this consumption problem is not resolved, which is a public health problem and not a security problem, we will continue to have this drug traffic. Drug trafficking also feeds a vicious circle of violence in Mexico, to the extent that drugs go from south to north, but weapons return from north to south, with the money from the sale of these same drugs. Weapons that are used by criminal groups here in Mexico to precisely provoke this problem of violence and homicides that we have witnessed for several decades, unfortunately, already. And then it is a problem of bilateral relations between both countries, a problem linked to drugs that instead of being taken as it is, which is a problem of public health in the north and the south, a problem of agricultural production and employment, basically it is an economic problem, we turned it into a security issue. A security problem that can be used to bias the bilateral relationship between the two countries and to impose an agenda, a policy agenda that is designed from the United States to be applied to Mexico, but not only to Mexico. This is a more global plan that has to do with U.S. imperialism at the level of the continent, because it is also a policy that has been implemented in other countries like Bolivia or like Plan Colombia. It is a policy motivated by the fight against drug trafficking, but in reality, it is also motivated by other outside interests, which are economic interests, natural resource extraction interests, government cooperation interests, financing, and so on. In other words, it is a policy, an interference motivated by the fight against drugs that in reality what it seeks is to subdue. What it seeks is to subordinate the policies of the countries of the South to the agenda of the U.S. government.
In the United States, most people, not everybody, but most people will not hesitate calling the police. So in that way, police has eyes and ears all over society. It can cover much more ground that they could on their own. So in Latin America is a very different scenario, because in Latin America, most people do not trust the police. Whether it's because the crime, they don't trust them as an effective agency, or they see them as an arm that imposes violence from the state towards the population. In that sense, it's like an extension of the class war. And so that's the disadvantage that the Mexican police in this moment has when they try to fight crime, because they don't have the eyes and ears in society, do they?
Sí, pues ese es el problema cuando se ve desde Estados Unidos, digamos que se tiende a
Yes, this is the problem. When you see from the United States, you tend to see things towards Mexico, the southern countries, as if they worked the same. And it is not the case. This is not the case for historical reasons, and that have to do with the process of formation of the state here in Mexico and in Latin America in general. The fundamental problem here is that the antagonism between the state and the drug trafficker, between drug traffickers, or between official authorities and criminal groups is blurred. This antagonism is not as obvious as it can be in the United States, because here what we have is rather a gray zone of corruption, of collusion, where not only do the authorities not fight against crime, but also they often actively participate in crime, in this commission of crimes, due to all this history of authoritarianism, of corruption that we find here in Mexico. So here it is very difficult to trust the authorities due to this same problem of corruption and collusion with criminal actors. So people don't go to the authorities, right? Because here, if you call the police, then you are actually adding a second to the first problem. Trust towards the authorities due to this corruption and collusion with the criminal activities are very problematic, and therefore, rather the people are, the citizens are abandoned. In abandonment because there is impunity. The impunity rate in Mexico is over 90%. In other words, 90% of crimes do not result in a judicial conviction. In most cases, then, there is no justice in most cases. Few cases are investigated, even fewer of the cases are prosecuted, and the conviction rate of people found guilty by the legal commission is very low. So it is a corrupt judicial system, but also very ineffective, which means that people have no choice but to organize themselves against the criminal threat, against the contingency. And that is what we have observed in recent years in Mexico, with the rise of self-defense groups, neighborhood committee groups, vigilante groups, and community police. Faced with the authorities' criminal collusion, the people are forced to organize and take justice into their own hands, taking care of their own security. Given this failed character of the Mexican security institutions that have been deeply corrupt, historically speaking, and who today actively participate in the criminal organization.
Históricamente hablando, y que hoy en día participan activamente de la organización criminal.
I understand, as you said, that opportunistic, politicians are evoking the Monroe Doctrine, which sees Latin America as the backyard for United States. But on the other hand, we have a real threat from transnational criminal narco bands. Those impose health on populations, in neighborhoods, in individuals, and in this case, to whole countries, like Ecuador. In our last show, we spoke about the case of Fernando Villavicencio, a presidential candidate who was murdered. He had proposed to build mega jails in the jungle like Bukele does, and he was going to take a similar approach to the one that the Salvadorian Presidente has fighting maras. He was going to do the same in Ecuador, or he was trying to do the same in Ecuador about the criminal bands. And he also, one of his main ideas was that Ecuador cannot fight these kind of crimes alone because it's a transnational crime. So it takes a transnational alliance to fight these crimes. Do you think that's the case? And if that's the case, how will it look like? Will it look like soldiers, boots on the ground, detectives, or social investment? How will it look like?
Pues mira, es curioso porque yo incluso conocí personalmente a Fernando. Yo viví 6 años en Ecuador antes de vivir en México.
Well, look, it's funny because I even know Fernando personally. I lived 6 years in Ecuador before moving to Mexico. I got to know his investigative journalistic work up close. Very good, by the way. And that very serious journalistic investigative work is what made him many enemies there in Ecuador, because he denounced the corruption of many oil contracts and has uncovered the entire network of corruption between government authorities and transnational companies around the extraction of oil resources in Ecuador, starting with oil. So he made very powerful enemies, and if they killed him, it's because he really represented a threat to these hegemonic economic interests, where we do not only find criminal groups, we also find a political class, we find oligarchic interests, we find business interests, we find collusion with criminal agents, but also military authorities. That is a very complex group. A network of interests and corruption is quite complex, with local roots, but also with transnational ramifications. I do not believe that the capacity of criminal groups should be overestimated. Although they are transnational, they do not stop operating in an illicit market. Most of the time around very precarious activities with many operational difficulties, with very important transaction costs, a permanent repression of their activities, as long as there is no protection from the official authorities. So I don't think that criminal power should be overestimated either, and I doubt that if they were able to kill Fernando Villavicencio, even though the perpetrators of the crime have been criminals, the masterminds of the crime, I don't think they have to do strictly or with these criminal groups. There is more, there is much more behind this crime. And in this sense, I believe that the problem has to do with how transnational markets are constituted today, and the generalized deregulation that neoliberal policies have caused for decades. But of course, the problem is transnational in nature, and therefore the response also has to be. And it has to be at the level of the markets, at the level of the illicit markets. The main problem with illicit markets is their illegal nature by definition. What makes an illegal activity profitable? Thinking about drugs, for example, and drug trafficking, since it's their illegalization, it's their illegal nature that makes it profitable. So I think that one of the paths that already exists in a certain consensus at the international level of experts has to do with the end of the prohibition of certain illegal activities, such as the drug trade. And there to go walking towards decriminalization and legalization, case by case, also depending on the substances, and on the other hand, a health policy that allows care and a health response to consumers, users of these substances. And there are several initiatives in this sense that would at least allow solving what is still at the heart of this illegal economy. But at a lawful level, actions can also be taken that have to do with market regulation, because these illegal activities and these criminal groups also live off money laundering. They live off what used to be called laundering.
Sería mucho más difícil con una mayor reglamentación,
In other words, that gray zone between illegal activities and legal activities would be much more difficult with greater regulation. Greater regulation of the banking sector. We already had several scandals here in Mexico. A scandal with HSBC Bank, which is one of the largest in the world, which turned out to be laundering drug money. Regulation of the banking sector, regulation of the real estate sector, where a lot of this dirty money is laundered from the sale of drugs and other extortion activities, human trafficking, prostitution, etc. And also regulation at the financial level, because as long as there are tax havens, as is the case of Panama with the Panama Papers or other Caribbean islands, even some states in the United States that are now dedicated to tax optimization and this type of activity, because it will be very difficult to fight against crime. So it is a matter of regulation that necessarily passes through the states and coordination at the transnational level. But as long as this social dumping policy is maintained between states of competition at the level of global markets and deregulation, it will be very difficult for us to provide solutions to this problem.
y de desregulación, pues difícilmente podremos aportar soluciones a esta problemática.
The Merida plan is like a Colombia plan, is like a Mexico plan, a militarization of the fight against crime, where, the army interacts with society on the streets. And in the Guacamaya papers, the Guacamaya leaks, we got a glance of the real influence that the Mexican army has in society. What's your opinion? What do you think about this?
No es ninguna solución, al contrario, es parte del problema. La militarización en México tiene raíces históricas, ¿no? Otra vez regresamos a los años 70, la guerra sucia.
It is not a solution. On the contrary, it is part of the problem. Militarization in Mexico has historical roots. Once again, we return to the 1970s, the dirty war, the anti-Zapatista struggle in the 1990s. But the scheme has deepened, and paradoxically, it has been done by a left-wing government, with a president who had said during his campaign in 2018 that he was going to return the military to the barracks. And he did the opposite. It not only deepened the military scheme, but it even institutionalized it. After the legalization of Peña Nieto's internal security law, now with the National Guard, we clearly have public security dominated by military interests. So it is very curious to see how governments from different parties have alternated. PAN, PRI, now Morena, and yet militarization has deepened even more. And what you say there is very true, in the sense that with this government, the current one, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the Army, and in particular the Secretary of National Defense, have been empowered, but also to the Navy, in an extraordinary way, giving new prerogatives that are unrelated to security work. Today in Mexico, the Navy, for example, manages customs. What does the Navy have to do with customs? But there it is. The Secretary of National Defense is now going to run an airline, for example. It is going to run a civil airline. And this is how, successfully, military interests were imposed to such a degree that today we can see that the Mexican army is a state within a state. And today we know that this strategy of militarization in the fight against crime is a failure. It is a counterproductive strategy that only deepens the spiral of violence and the vicious circle of violence. We, the sociologists, have already measured the effects of the military operations and where they have sent military convoys to supposedly fight against crime. The only thing that has been achieved is to further deepen the rates of violence, with more homicides, more kidnappings, more forced disappearances. And then it is not part of the solution. On the contrary. Another problem is how to later recover that given power granted to the military. It will be very difficult for future governments, for the civilians, the civil institutions, to recover these prerogatives granted to the military. And finally, it will also become a problem for the army itself, because in the long run, it won't suit the military either. Now they can have immediate economic interests of gain. It is very profitable for them at the moment, but they are exposing themselves to the danger of corruption. And although the secrecy and opacity that have historically surrounded the Secretary of National Defense in Mexico, the Ministry of National Defense, protects it from certain scandals and their media coverage. These scandals are going to emerge sooner or later. It's only a matter of time because the military is no less corrupt than the police or the judges or the prison guards. They're equally corrupt and corruptible, and they face this danger, and the scandals are already coming out. There was a problem with the former head of the Secretariat, General Cienfuegos, who a few years ago was accused in the United States of ties to organized crime. There are the McCall links that you just mentioned, and the problem with this abrogation of power is growing, which the army is facing, is the corruption of its cadres, its high command, and, on the other hand, the danger that the problem of human rights and its violation by part of the military. A few months ago, for example, a video was released in Tamaulipas of an extrajudicial execution by a military patrol. I don't know if you've seen this video. It's from a supermarket surveillance camera where it is clearly seen how, following a persecution, the military patrol arrives and ends up executing the alleged criminals. So we are facing these problems of corruption and violation of human rights instead of exploring alternatives, such as police reform and the legalization of certain drugs and the production of medicines. In short, instead of looking for alternatives, it persists in a militaristic paradigm that has already proven to be a lost war for several decades.
Se obstina en un paradigma militarista que ya ha mostrado ser una guerra perdida desde hace varias décadas.
In Governor DeSantis' words, there's an implicit admission of failure in the fact that all this support, all this money we have poured into the Mexican army and intelligence services have failed. Otherwise, he wouldn't see the necessity from the United States to send special forces now, right?
Sí, sí, obviamente que la culpa es mexicana, ¿no?
Yeah, about that. Obviously, the fault is Mexican, according to the US side. The problems are south of the border in Mexico. And therefore, if the institutions in charge of prosecuting crimes and repressing crime are not capable of doing so, then the only solution from this perspective is for our institutions, the North American ones, our corporations, to intervene on the ground in Mexican territory in order to solve the problem that Mexicans are incapable of solving. But from there, the question is therefore, all this military aid, this financial aid, this bilateral cooperation, and even this advice from the DEA, for example, which has been historic in Mexico, well, where are the results? Where are the results of this help? And then there, if we turn our gaze again, we see that at least if there is failure, the responsibility is shared on both sides of the border.
We tend to think according to what we live, and we live in a very different world than Mexico here in the United States. So can you tell us what will happen if U.S. Special Forces were to actually cross the border and do, enforcing operations down south in Mexico? What will the people think? What will the people do?
No lo veo factible. Honestamente, a corto o mediano plazo, no veo, a menos de que se trate de...
I don't see it feasible, honestly, in the short or medium term. I don't see, unless it's about covert operations, that there have been, covert military operations on Mexican soil, but it has to be a limited number of operations, because if not, sooner or later this type of operation will be publicized. And I don't see that the Mexicans are willing to accept the direct intervention of foreign military forces on their soil, and neither the federal government, the current one, nor I think the next one, are going to accept an intervention of this type, which would clearly be seen as some kind of invasion. And we must also take into account that nationalism in Mexico is very important. It is a very nationalistic country with a fairly patriotic population, which would clearly see an intervention by U.S. military forces, not to mention gringos, as clearly an aggression that would warrant an equal response by force. And this would lead to unprecedented tension on the border, with militarization on both sides of the border, and this would jeopardize many economic interests, because it is one of the borders, if not the most dynamic border in the world in economic terms. The economic interests there are gigantic, especially at the industrial level and on both sides of the border, because not only Mexicans benefit from the relocation of North American industry south of the border, the North American industry also takes advantage of the cost of labor and the knowledge of Mexican workers. So it's a relationship of mutual dependency, and I don't think governments are willing to sacrifice these very important economic interests, risking some kind of military operation of this nature. Clearly, there would be a military operation would cause a lot of outrage south of the border. The government would not let it pass, and they would take us down an alley. There is a dead end and a relationship of force that would strain the bilateral relationship too much. So it's something, honestly, that I don't see as feasible. That Ron DeSantis says it in an electoral context is very profitable, politically speaking. It does not commit him too much. It doesn't matter if later there will be a bad relationship with the Mexican government. I see it more as a kind of demagogy, populist demagogy, to please their electorate. But beyond that, I don't see a future for this type of
No le
proposal.
veo futuro a este tipo de propuestas.